Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kausji. Niaga Spotlight takes us through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Now today on analysis, our spotlight is on the Sabah floods and counting the cost. Malaysia Day was of course this week, though of course celebrations in Sabah were cancelled as 6 districts are underwater and the state is battling its deadliest flood and landslide crisis in nearly 30 years. As of earlier yesterday, 3,168 people from 892 households were sheltering in 27 relief centres across 128 kampongs. The hardest hit districts, Penampang, Beaufort, Papar, Membakut, Putatan, Sipitang and Tawau are in chaos. Roads have been cut off, power and clean water supplies disrupted, and entire communities isolated. The death toll stands at roughly 13, including 7 children, with reports of families trapped by sudden landslides. For the first time in decades, Sabah's storm season isn't just a humanitarian disaster, it is also an economic shockwave. Now, rail services from Beaufort Tenom are suspended, rural supply routes have collapsed, and cold chain logistics for food and medicine are also breaking down. Now, this is also, of course, happening in a state where 19.7% of households already live in absolute poverty. When the poorest lose their homes, their livestock and their only income streams, every ringgit of loss multiplies, deepening Sabah's structural vulnerabilities. Today on Niaga Spotlight, we cut through the noise to ask, why are these floods worsening year after year? What are the hidden costs, from lost work hours to destroyed infrastructure, that aren't showing up in the headlines or the CPI, the Consumer Price Index? And most importantly, how do we fund long-term resilience instead of paying for the same relief every time monsoon season comes around? Joining us online for this interview is Saizal Pinjaman, Director of the Centre for Economic Development and Policy at University Malaysia, Sabah. He'll help us unpack Sabah's flood economics, from land use policies and climate finance to the urgent reforms needed to protect Sabah's most vulnerable communities and safeguard its economic future. A very good morning to you, Saizal. How are you doing today? Thank you so much for making time to join us for this timely interview.
Good morning, Tahmina. Thank you very much for contacting me.
Absolutely. So let's get started off with the discussion, Saizal. Now, of course, when the waters rise, there are not only lives at risk, it's also the foundation of Sabah's economy that has to be looked at. So can you perhaps give us an economic perspective on the snapshot of the flood crisis? We know, of course, there are an increasing number of evacuees, the districts which are affected, but also is there any estimate out there of immediate financial losses to households, small businesses and also local governments as we're looking at it?
Well, at this stage, there is no official public estimate of the total immediate financial losses from homes, small businesses or local government costs for the recent Sabah flood. But what we know is that NADMA has approved an immediate allocation of 10 million to assist flood victims. And in addition to about 11 million already channeled through the state government for immediate repairs to basic facilities in the affected areas. And each evacuated family head is reportedly receiving 1,000 ringgit of BWI or Bantuan Wang Ihsan for Malaysian citizen, and next to kin for those deceased receive around 10,000 ringgit. And in terms of housing, if we use official government repair and rebuilding cost benchmarks, the damage of the affected families could already be in the range of perhaps between 7 to 10 million. And meanwhile, for small businesses, which are the lifeline of Sabah's local economy, the best estimate is around perhaps 700 to 1,000 SMEs are disrupted, including grocery shops, eateries, car workshops, hawker stalls. So based on the typical per firm losses of up to 30,000 ringgit for floods, this point to another tens of millions of ringgits in damages. And in terms of infrastructure side, we already know that Sabah electricity transmission towers damaged, and it left over 230,000 consumers without power. So several roads in Penampang, Papar, and Beaufort have been cut off by landslide, which not only adds tens of millions of ringgit in repair costs, but also disrupt access to school, clinics, and local businesses. These are immediate fiscal shocks for state and, of course, for the local government. And when we combine household, SMEs, and infrastructure, the immediate economic footprint for this disaster, I assume, would already be between 40 million to 90 million, and I believe it will grow as agriculture and public facilities are fully assessed.
Absolutely. So that is clearly painting for us a very sober picture, and thank you for being so clear around that. Those power supplies earlier, which have knocked out supply for perhaps in excess of 250K users, the Beaufort Tenem rail suspended. So all of this is pointing to a clean shock to logistics and also the price of essential goods in flood-hit districts. There's also, of course, then the hidden bill. There were actually 122 disaster incidents which were logged across the first 8 days when the floods occurred. Key trunk roads have also been blocked. For example, Jalan Papar to Kota Kinabalu. Now, there's also lost worker hours, inventory spoilage, and all of these estimates which can also quantify GDP adjacent damage. Perhaps not now, but maybe in the next quarter we'll really be able to tell more numbers. Thank you for the brief overview. Moving along, Saizal, let's talk about looking at the 5-year structural drivers and also economic cost of inaction. So some research which has been carried out by UMS and DID, the Department of Irrigation and Drainage, highlights drainage density, land use, slope and soil as critical factors in the Moyog and Penampang basins in particular. From an economist point of view, Saizal, how have land use changes since 2020 especially impacted not only the flood intensity but also public expenditure?
True, Tamina. Since 2020, the Moyog and Penampang Basin have seen steady urban expansion and land clearing on hill slopes. So built-up areas have increased while vegetated and open spaces have declined. So the effect is more frequent inundation in downstream areas. And of course, the effect is more floods. So this intensification translates directly into fiscal costs. So the local government spend repeatedly on repairing roads, schools, and other utilities after each flood. And on top of that, the federal government, as we know, has already identified that Sabah still requires around 800 million ringgit in unfinished comprehensive flood mitigation works. So in short, land use change is making each flood more expensive to clean up, and of course, is enforcing government into costly cycle of relief and repair rather than one-off prevention. And in terms of agriculture, the flood damage field more often. Crops are destroyed, soils eroded, and replanting costs rises. So national figures shows that agricultural losses from flood have run into tens of millions of ringgit in recent years, including Sabah. So for smallholders, this not just an environmental issue, but a direct economic shock that will reduce their household income. And of course, in terms of insurance, if we can include that, data also show that after 2021 flood in Peninsular Malaysia, insurance paid out billions of ringgit, and the demand for flood cover increased. So as flood in Sabah grow more intense and more frequent, claim for damaged homes, vehicles, and SMEs or small business premises are bound to rise as well. Yet flood insurance coverage remain low, especially in this state, where it means that many households and SMEs are still bearing losses out of their own pocket. So that combination, raising claims for those insured and raising costs out of pocket for those uninsured, is another economic burden created by the land use change.
Clearly, I mean, development also does come with its cost, and perhaps referring a little bit back and to the cycle, the 2014 Penampang flood. At that point in time, it affected around 40,000 people across 70 villages. It does remain a benchmark for economic risk analysis. Perhaps, Saizal, what are the cost-benefit trade-offs of prevention versus repeated disaster relief spending, having a more forward-looking agenda in this area?
Okay, so in terms of prevention costs, I believe that the completion of flood mitigation project is estimated to be at around 800 million ringgit under the current federal plan. And this is a significant sum, of course, but it is a one-time capital investment spread over several years. So preventive measures also include stricter land use control, slope stabilization, and maintaining riparian buffers, which cost less per year but reduce long-term exposure. So that is in terms of prevention costs. In terms of costs of repeated itself, on the other hand, each major flood now costs tens of millions of ringgit in housing damage, SME disruption, agricultural losses, and of course, in terms of infrastructure repairs. So based on the December 2021 flood in Peninsular Malaysia, for example, it generated loss to be around 6 billion ringgit nationally. So even this current Sabah's disaster may already be costing 40 to 90 million ringgit, as I mentioned earlier, in its early phase. So if you repeat that every few years, the cumulative bill easily overtakes the one-off prevention costs. And the benefit side of prevention is that it avoided damages, it avoid uninterrupted businesses as well, or it leads to uninterrupted business activity in lower insurance claim. They also protect livelihood, and that is very important, which is harder to price but critical for welfare. And in terms of cost-benefit term, the net present value of prevention is strongly positive because avoided losses compound year after year.
And additionally, also landslide mortality this week was the worst in decades, coming as a fact of soils being supersaturated, making even modest slopes risky. This is clear evidence that land use and extreme rain is clearly an economic risk system, not just a weather blip. Thank you. Moving along from there into looking at the Malaysia Day optics and fiscal priorities in disaster response. So Malaysia Day events were cancelled in Sabah to focus on flood relief. How can the state government, Saizal, further signal clear fiscal priorities to the public, balancing symbolic celebrations with, of course, the urgent spending needs currently?
Yeah. There are no publicly available figures showing exactly how much Sabah spent on Malaysia Day celebration annually. But based on comparable cultural event budget and the logistics involved, a reasonable estimate would be somewhere between 1 million to 2 million, possibly more depending on scale. Thus, I fully support the state's decision to cancel Malaysia's Day celebration this year, as it was a responsible move that sends a strong message about fiscal priorities for the state. When hundreds of families are displaced and key infrastructure is damaged, every ringgit must go into relief, repair, and recovery, the 3R. And I believe the state can signal fiscal priorities by being transparent about the reallocation of funds. For example, if 1 to 2 million earmark for celebration is diverted into evacuation centers, school repairs, or agricultural support, the government should say so openly, and I believe they are currently doing that. So this is the kind of reporting that helps the public see the direct trade-off between what was sacrificed and what was gained.
Clearly, and also perhaps the OPEX that has been diverted away from Malaysia Day could feed into maybe 90-day deliverables, kilometers desilted, perhaps retention ponds commissioned and completed, high-risk slopes stabilized. It's really important to have this sort of a transparent ongoing accounting of funds that are being used. Thanks very much for the perspective so far, Saizal. We take a short break now on Niaga Spotlight. We'll be right back with the rest of the interview. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight, still with me, Tamina Kausji. And today, of course, in conjunction with Malaysia Day, we have a spotlight on Sabah floods and looking at the cost and what actually is happening on ground. Joining me online for this very timely and interesting discussion is Saizal Pinjaman, who's Director with the Centre for Economic Development and Policy with University Malaysia Sabah. Going back straight into the discussion, Saizal, let's look at now cost of living shock channels. Now, floods in particular disrupt logistics, supply chains, especially in rural Sabah, where transport networks are rather fragile. Now, while Malaysia's national inflation was very stable at just about 1.2% year-on-year in July 2025, food away from home, FAFH, remains high at around 4.3% year-on-year. So some comments on this regard to looking at how temporary road closures and crop losses in flood-affected districts then create localized price spikes that may not necessarily be captured in our national CPI averages.
Okay, yeah. Flood in Sabah, they don't just damage property. They also disrupt the supply chain, and Sabah's economy is far more vulnerable to logistic shocks because it depends on one main route that connects the east coast of Sabah and the west coast of Sabah. In Peninsular Malaysia, if one way or one highway is closed, there are alternative road that allows goods to be rerouted. But in Sabah, when a landslide blocks a key road in Ranau, for example, there are a very few alternatives that connect the east coast and the west coast of the state. So supplies are either delayed by hours or they are detoured over long and difficult terrain, or in some cases, cut off entirely. So this creates what economists call a bottleneck in affected districts. Then local traders may raise their price in short term because supply is constrained and transport costs surge. And on top of that, crop losses also add another layer. When paddy field, for example, or vegetable plots are inundated, local supply shrinks and replacement crops must be brought from other areas or perhaps even imported. And that adds both time and cost and further inflating prices at the village and the district level. And in terms of service disruption, it also intensifies these pressures. In Sandakan, for example, water supply interruption forced households to buy bottled water for tank deliveries, and it immediately raising living costs. In Tawau is another example where transmission tower damages left hundreds of thousands of consumers without power. So businesses and households had to rely on diesel generators. We call it genset in Sabah, which are costly to run. So for small eateries, food processors, and cold storage businesses, the power cut directly translate into spoiled inventory and higher operating costs, which quickly pass on consumers through higher menu prices. So all of this shows how fragile the supply chain are in Sabah, and that translate into the price hike, especially in several districts that are affected.
Clearly, and also these sharp price spikes in essentials like bottled water, etc., are not necessarily then reflected back in our national averages, but it does cause a localized impact. What targeted subsidies or perhaps micro grants would be most useful or effective to stabilize such local economies in this immediate aftermath then, Saizal?
Okay, I believe the first priority should be the targeted subsidies or cash transfers, especially in the hardest hit district. And temporary food vouchers, for example, for displaced household can cushion immediate shocks. And the Bantuan Wang Ehsan or BWI is, of course, effective because they let households make their own spending decision while restoring some lost purchasing power. And in terms of micro grants for small businesses, I believe that targeting micro grants of perhaps between 3,000 to 10,000 can help hawkers or grocery shops to replace their spoiled stock, repairing their equipment or cover rent utilities while income is interrupted. And for the agricultural recovery support, I believe that for smallholders, subsidies should be directed into inputs, including seeds, fertilizer, or livestock feed and farm tools to get production restarted quickly. A replanting subsidy or a direct input, I believe, is more useful because it ensures that the money goes straight into restoring output. And in terms of utilities and logistic relief, I believe where water and power outrages or outages occur, micro grants to pay water tankers or to cover diesel fees can help SMEs in household bridge the gap until services are restored. And this prevent businesses from collapsing under utility costs and keep supply chain functioning in the state.
The supply chain clearly is actually experiencing a cold chain break and also lots of last mile premiums. So this, of course, raises clear preference for temporary freight subsidies and also stock buffers in all of these flood-related belts. Not also mentioning the fact that prolonged closures throttle labour supply for schools, for the workforce as well. So moving on from there, looking at election season governance and budget credibility, Sabah State Assembly also must dissolve by 11th November this year, with polling required by early December at the latest. The Election Commission has denied any fixed date. Now, with elections also looming on the state, what realistic flood mitigation promises can be funded within perhaps a single state budget cycle, firstly?
Yeah, as we know that the state election is just around the corner. And I think for the state, promises that are not just work technically, but budget friendly or budget credible, cost effective, and welfare enhancing within 1 year is very important for the state. So this is because large scale flood schemes for the state require federal funding, and it takes a very long time to complete. So what the state can realistically deliver is a single budget cycle. In a single budget cycle is a smaller intervention with high economic or welfare return relative to their costs. So first, the targeted spending on critical drain and culvert produces an outsized benefit because it reduces recurrent losses in densely populated neighborhood, especially in the urban area like Kota Kinabalu, Tawau, or Sandakan. And the cost is modest compared to the repeated household and SME damages avoided. Second, the state can also fund for slope stabilization at known landslide sites to prevent road closures that otherwise disrupt our already fragile supply chain. So economically, this is about preserving market access. So when truck roads are severed, food prices spike locally, and the SMEs are losing their business days. And households, of course, face higher living costs. So a few million ringgit spent on stabilization can prevent tens of millions in welfare losses. And apart from that, the budget on basic early warning system can also be a good option for the state because the installation of rainfall and river gorges costs little, but the information they generate have huge social value because it reduces fatalities, it guides evacuation and minimizes losses to assets and crops. And apart from that, committing to routine desilting and riverbank maintenance is also very important because economically, this reduces volatility in fiscal account. It's cheaper to budget for predictable maintenance than to repeat drawn on emergency fund for post-flood repairs. And of course, apart from that, publishing a monthly flood resilience scorecard also improve budget credibility. So if I can add on, if we can look into examples that have been taken abroad, China, for example, implemented what is called as Sponge City, where it is a pilot project that shows immediate effect in reducing damages. And apart from that, Philippines, for example, have what is known as Project NOAA, which demonstrated high return on investment from hazard mapping and early warning. So all these are examples of government using relatively modest short-term intervention to achieve high economic or welfare impact.
And also, at the same time, there are certain actions, though, which must be jointly financed with perhaps federal agencies, especially looking at illegal logging, enforcement, and catchment rehabilitation. Some ideas on what the collaboration needs to look like so that perhaps next year, when we're looking at 2026, we're hopefully not dealing with the same type of inundation and disaster zones across Sabah.
Yeah. So as we know, forestry and catchment management fall under the state list, and Sabah has constitutional authority over forest reserve, timber concession enforcement. But the financing burden can be shared to achieve outcomes that benefit both the state and the federal. So illegal logging enforcement, for example, is resource intensive. So while Sabah lead federal agency like MACC or NRECC can provide complementary roles in funding and monitoring as well as technical support. In terms of reforestation and catchment rehabilitation, we have similar situation. These are capital intensive programs with long-term horizons. And while Sabah has authority to implement, federal development grants make the financing sustainable. And we have done that under the 12th Malaysia Plan, where federal finance reforestation was carried out by state agencies. So economically, this is justified because catchment restoration reduces future flood damages and it stabilizes water supply and preserve diversity. So the most efficient arrangement is clear. The state continues to enforce and implement, but the federal government co-finances through structured budget channels.
And also clearly a lot of procurement disciplines such as fast-tracking works that name choke points which have currently been identified, with also transparent tender logs and clerk of work photos perhaps. Moving deeper into the conversation on equity and poverty and designing inclusive relief. Now Sabah does have Malaysia's highest absolute poverty rate, roughly around 19.7% as of 2022. From an economic lens, Saizal, what policy changes are required urgently so that cash transfers, these evacuation logistics and also business recovery grants reach the most needy, meaning of course rural women, indigenous communities and also elderly residents without leakages or any delay?
Yeah, the state already runs several initiatives, including the EKC registry to identify poor household and the DWI under Dharma disaster cash aid. Yet three challenges persist, I assume. First is targeting is incomplete because indigenous communities often underrepresented in official data, reducing the fiscal impact of transfers. The second issue is delivery is slowed by poor banking access and patchy rural connectivity because as we know, as they are disconnected, they cannot go to the nearest town, for example. So this create delays and perhaps leakages. And evacuees face delays in receiving assistance if they have no bank account or have to rely on manual distribution at bank counters. So the third issue is business recovery support for small firms is tied up in heavy documentation and slow approval, meaning micro entrepreneurs, especially women, often miss the critical window for working capital. So policy improvement, I believe, should therefore be focusing on tightening access and speed. So an integrated registry that combine the EKC with village-level validation would ensure vulnerable households are not left out. And apart from that, cash transfer should flow through multiple payment rails, either directly through bank transfer, check or cash handovers, or perhaps e-wallet, which women in the household set as the default recipients to maximize their welfare effect. And evacuation logistics need to be pre-arranged by contracting either local boat operators or 4x4 cooperative or team before the monsoon, while elderly household can be tagged by priority evacuation or for priority evacuation to reduce delays in past flood operation. And to strengthen the business resilience in the state, a parametric grant system, which have been implemented by several countries, can also be introduced where micro grants, perhaps between 3,000 to 5,000, can be automatically dispersed to women and indigenous entrepreneurs in affected areas within a few days, followed by a simple verification of business reopening. So importantly, this should be paired with a streamlined or online application platform to get assistance, for example, for both individuals and SMEs. So this designed with mobile-friendly features so beneficiaries can apply quickly and track status transparently without burdensome paperwork. So we have various government developed apps that we can utilize for such streamlined online application.
And clearly that would be one of the most pressing needs right now because poorer households, of course, lack the sufficient amount of savings and insurance, which makes them far more vulnerable in this immediate aftermath of the flood risk and disaster. Thank you so much for your insights, Saizal. It's been truly insightful. Now, we've heard hard truths from Saizal Pinjaman. The floods are not just a weather story, they are a systemic economic failure decades in the making. Unchecked land use changes, disappearing forests, around 20,600 hectares lost last year alone in Sabah, and unplanned urbanization have turned routine rains into catastrophic floods and deadly landslides. What was made clear were these points. Repeated devastation is eroding productivity, supply chains have been severed, labor's out for days, inflation surging in cut-off areas. Now, also poor households, Sabah's 19.7% absolute poverty, they have to absorb the worst with no backups, no buffer and no insurance. The fix, of course, is investment, not just sympathy and emergency aid. This means early warning systems, land use enforcement, forest protection and also potential parametric insurance to convert recurring relief spending into resilience capital. Election season or not, the test is real. Will Sabah shift resources from reaction to prevention? Because every ringgit spent rebuilding the same losses is one more ringgit that Sabah cannot afford. That's all we have time for today. We'll see you again next week with more economic analysis and insights. I'm Tamina Kausji signing off for now. Here's to a productive week ahead.